Afternoon from London, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on being smart with artificial intelligence, deploying AI in the public sector. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former senior civil servant here in the UK, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar on behalf of the Publishing House Global Government Forum that serves civil servants and public servants all around the world. And I'd also like to say a very big thank you to our knowledge partner today that is Deloitte. It's with their support that we are able to provide this webinar to civil servants all around the globe. So the theme of today is artificial intelligence and deploying AI in the public sector. And artificial intelligent technologies have huge potential in improving civil service management, policy making, and service delivery. But there is growing recognition that their application is not without some risk. Poor system design, low quality data can skew decisions, embed historic biases, or generate the wrong outcomes and conclusions. And because AI algorithms evolve over time, sometimes creating systems that are very opaque, they also present challenges around transparency and accountability in decision making. So today's webinar will explore how civil servants and civil services around the world can fully realise the benefits of AI. And it's great that so many officials and civil servants are really looking to embrace these new technologies, but doing so without falling foul of some of those dangers. How can these public bodies develop the technical and commercial expertise to build, commission and deploy AI effectively? And I'm sure we'll be covering some of those tricky issues around transparency and accountability. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel member. We've got 4 brilliant experts with us here today, and each of our panel members will give an opening presentation, but we're also going to leave as much time as we can for questions at the end. So please do, if you're watching, use the Q&A function that you have on your screens to message in your questions as you're listening to the presentations. And after our panel members have spoken, we will get through as many of those questions as we can at the end. So now to our fantastic panel, who I'm going to introduce. First, we will hear from Michael Schoenstein, and Michael is Head of Strategic Foresight and Analysis at the Policy Lab Digital Work and Society in the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs in Germany. He coordinates activities on digital transformation in labour and social affairs, including the German AI strategy and the German AI Observatory. Prior to this, Michael held various positions in the German Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, the German Federal Ministry of Health, and at the OECD. After Michael, we'll hear from Vic Pant, who is Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor at Natural Resources Canada. Vic is responsible for providing strategic direction, building capacity, and assessing future needs within Canada's science and technology communities. He's responsible for accelerating the application of digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, to research, analysis, and evidence-based policymaking. And he works closely with his counterparts from other science-based organizations to ensure that the management of federal policy and research activities align with the Government of Canada priorities. After we've heard from Vic, we will go to Nadan Muthukumarana, who has over 24 years experience in delivering data analytics and technology transformation with clients all around the world. At Deloitte, Nadan is the lead partner for data analytics and artificial intelligence in public and transportation sectors, working with governments to develop AI solutions that bring improvements in service delivery, in operational planning and asset management. Nadan also runs the Deloitte Analytics Labs, an innovation incubator that specializes in the development of products which combine AI with simulation technologies. And then last, but definitely not least, we'll head over to the United States, where we'll hear from Taka Ariga, who's Chief Data Scientist and Director at the Innovation Lab in the US Government Accountability Office. Taka is the first Chief Data Scientist appointed by the Comptroller General of the United States for the Government Accountability Office. He also leads GAO's newly established Innovation Lab, which is driving experiments across audit and operational teams through the use of advanced analytics and emerging technologies. As a member of the Senior Executive Service, Tucker is also responsible for working with GAO stakeholders to adopt prospective views on oversight impacts of emerging capabilities, including AI. So we have a really fantastic panel with us today. Some of you may also have been expecting to hear from Sana Karagani, who actually heads the work of the UK government's Office of Artificial Intelligence. But very sadly, Sana has had to send her apologies today because senior civil servants in the UK aren't carrying out any public-facing events until after the funeral of Prince Philip on Saturday. We hope that Sana will be able to join us in other events in the future. So as I say, a reminder, please, to do send in your questions as you're listening to our panel members. And without further ado, I am going to invite Michael to give us the first presentation. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Siobhan, for the introduction and indeed for the invitation. I think this is a great panel to be part of, and I really look forward to the discussion with everyone who's listening and looking in. It would indeed be of high interest for me to get some questions as well, because I've got the experience and we usually learn a lot more from the audience than the other way around. You will also notice I'll bring a lot of questions rather than answers. I'm starting out from a very sector-specific view here. As Siobhan mentioned, I am one of the coordinators of the German AI strategy overall, but my perspective here now is the one wearing my other hat, which is trying to foster the uptake of AI in labor and social administration in Germany. We can go to the next slide, please. By way of background, I just want to point out that there's a German idiosyncrasy in the way we're set up that I think is a big difference from especially Anglo-Saxon countries, in that our employment insurance, our pension insurance, accident insurance, and so forth, all operate in a sort of power sharing setup where it's not the federal government that actually runs these services. Rather, they are jointly run by federal government and the social partners. So the employers' associations and the labor unions, or rather the confederation of trade unions. This is important because it means that we cannot really tell them to do anything that they don't agree to do. That is why in everything that we do relating to the uptake of artificial intelligence in labor and social administration, we've adopted a consensus approach that really tries to develop solutions together. We don't only do that because of our power sharing setup. It is also, of course, because we try to connect the dots between very similar issues that range across the different agencies. Everybody struggles with similar questions when it comes to technology introduction, but of course in our specific sector also, everybody struggles with the same sensitivities. The people we serve, usually when they address us, are in moments of crisis or vulnerability. For example, having lost their job or having been victim of a violent crime or an accident. On top of that, very often the populations we serve on average are less tech savvy than the average population, for example, because they're older or because they're people with special needs. So these are joint challenges that range across and that we try to tackle in what we do. In the first step, and I think that highlights a little bit how far we are sometimes from our agencies that implement, we wanted to find out what is actually going on with artificial intelligence. Nobody's waiting in the employment agency for the federal ministry to come along and ask them to please implement a bit of AI here and there. They're actually doing it by themselves. And I think the total number of IT specialists in our employment agency is higher than the people working in the ministry altogether. So just for your image of what we're working with. So we found a range of applications that we'll talk about in a moment, and that immediately made our political leadership a little bit nervous because, of course, we've committed as the German government to a range of international, in a range of international fora to guidelines about the ethical implementation of artificial intelligence. For example, the OECD guidelines. I think they've also been taken up by the G20. And of course, what we're trying to do first now, having learned that quite a lot is going on already, is trying to bridge the gap between those international guidelines that we've committed to and sort of really operational implementation advice that we can use to guide the work in our different agencies. And in addition to that, what we've started, and all of this happens in parallel, even though we'd like to do it sequentially in an ideal world, we're also funding innovation projects and prototyping of individual solutions. If we can go to the next slide, please. I would characterize what is going on right now in three broad categories, and I'll have an example for each. What we see by far most is the improvement of individual steps within existing administrative processes by use of artificial intelligence. An example, I think, that's very, very typical of probably 80, maybe even 90% of all that's being deployed is that in order to continue receiving child benefits when you're over the age of 18, you have to be enrolled in higher education. So to continue the receipt, you have to send in an enrollment confirmation every semester from your university. That is checked, and benefits continue to be paid as long as you're enrolled. That process has been automated with the help of image and text recognition. That's a pretty straightforward thing to do. We have the technology for that. We have the data for that. Could be done. The reason we're very often limited to such individual steps is because actually a lot of hurdles remain in the law itself. For example, a lot of procedures still require a handwritten signature. And unfortunately, very often that is written in the actual legal text that defines the benefit, which means that in order to digitize the process, you first actually have to go through a complete legislative process to change the text of the law, which is something that nobody's willing to do for an individual process. So we always have to wait for opportunities where larger reforms are happening, so we can add on a little bit of a streamlining in the legal text to then engage in digitization. But this is a very important hurdle here. Nevertheless, I would say we do a lot of process improvement at that level. What happens more rarely, but also happens, is the redesign of processes from scratch. Where we're doing that right now is in the registration of new hires in social security. So if you're an employer in the private sector and you hire somebody, you need to register them for pension insurance, unemployment insurance, and so forth. We're redesigning the process by which that happens so that people can get advice by text, by calling, by emailing from basically bots that take them through the process of registering their new employees using a mixture of speech recognition, text recognition, image recognition, and also text generation in this process. And that works because we can set it up from scratch in this case. This process that we're setting up from scratch will exist in parallel to the traditional one. So in theory, you can also print out a form, fill it out, and send it in by post. That will still be possible because we need to keep an omni-channel approach open. And then the final category I want to highlight is developing altogether new services by use of machine learning or artificial intelligence. We've just prototyped a platform that will help counseling for lifelong learning for all workers in Germany. The idea here is that we match people that have done a competence assessment with their sort of results from such a competence assessment. We match that information with local labor market development, so looking at the supply and demand changes in skills in a given region. And then, as a third element, add to that information about locally available training opportunities. It's a prototype that's available. We're starting a pilot project probably in the end of the year, and we'll see how that goes. But this, to my knowledge, at least at present, is the only true service innovation where we come up with an altogether new service because we can use new technology. So this is extremely rare. Now, if we zoom away from the concrete implementations a little bit and maybe move to the next slide, please. I would like sort of to leave behind three provocations for the discussion here, sort of abstracting a little bit from the work that we've been doing so far. To me, it seems increasingly that technological developments and data availability alone are not actually the game changers for AI diffusion right now. We have a lot of that already. It's there. What we see is rather, and that's my second point, that diffusion is constrained by law, not only by issues like the signature example that I brought, but also by the fact that a lot of discretion is given to administrators, so humans, when they take decisions about benefits. And that is for good reasons, because our benefits need to mirror the, let's say, individual needs of the citizens that receive them. And that makes it very, very difficult to codify and turn into algorithms. At the same time, I think there's another constraint in skills shortages. We do have a lot of people working in IT, but they're not necessarily trained to develop and deploy AI. The demand that I see, sort of what really drives diffusion, I think is demographic change, because about 30% of our workforce will be retiring in the next 15 years within the workforce of our agencies, and we will definitely not be replacing them one for one. So we have a big pressure to manage workloads. Because mind you, everybody who retires becomes a client for the very same service they retire from. And of course, also citizens have increased service expectations. I mean, look how easy it is to find a partner on Tinder compared to how easy it is to find a training class for your professional advancement. That's just not happening with one swipe. So that's I think also an important driver. And finally, I would like to highlight again, sort of in response to this very sensitive nature of what we're doing, that the social processes and the work organization around technology and its implementation matter, I think, a little bit more than the technology itself. We need to make sure human oversight is there and that people that administrate are actually trained to oversee and understand recommendations that come from algorithms. I hope that's enough provocation and information for debate, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. That's such a great way to start the presentation. I think you've given us a really good kind of introduction and oversight, talking about taking those international principles and guidelines and some of the maybe the challenges to bring those into something that works domestically. I think every country is going to have different challenges. You mentioned the ones in Germany, but I'm sure each country will have its own specific challenges. Really important that you said the need already to understand what's already happening, because I think that ties into the some of the concerns around transparency. So do we even know already where AI is being used? Great to have some of those examples, that things that are already being done in the area of kind of labour and social affairs. But also I like the idea of then looking ahead to completely new services. So not just improving ones that we already do, but the potential to actually be offering completely new services. And really good, those kind of questions at the end, very much leaving us with that note of, but actually we have to maintain that human oversight, and do we have enough people who really understand this? So great way to open. Thank you very much. Vic, I'm going to come to you for our next presentation.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. I'd like to start by thanking Kevin and Alexa and Maria from the Global Governance Forum for convening this presentation. Also, thanks to you, Siobhan, for chairing it, and to Michael, Taka, and Nudun for being great panelists. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And also, Michael really set up the context for my opening remarks really well, because I agree with many of the things. Not so much, they weren't so much provocative. I found myself to be in agreement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital accelerator in my department, because this will set the stage for some of my comments in the panel discussion to follow. The Digital Accelerator in Natural Resources Canada is a high technology or an advanced technology launchpad. It's a forum where we incubate and accelerate creative applications of technology to see what kind of impact that they can make if we are ready to scale them at a future time. So next slide, please. When we started the Digital Accelerator in this framing, we really had 4 goals. The first goal was certainly what it is that we were trying to do, which was creative applications of innovative technologies to advance science and policy integration. So very often when we see a technology stack such as artificial intelligence or data science, it's very alluring, it's very attractive to just start playing with it and to make predictions and to build clusters and to do all kinds of awesome recommendations coming out of it. But really the question is, we want to apply those advanced technologies, but that's the what, but we want to answer the so what questions, which is how is this now being mapped to something that is within the mission and mandate of our department, or the priorities and plans of our department. So that was the first thing. The second part that was very, very important when we set up this advanced technology lab, you can call it, or a incubator or accelerator in our department, launchpad, I like to call it, we wanted to make sure that this did not become a silo, because we had seen in many private and public sector organizations, these kinds of models had been tested before, and they did really good within the focus or the scope of the accelerator, but the rest of the department or the rest of the organization didn't truly benefit from the knowledge that the experts had in that launchpad or in that lab. So we wanted to make sure that the overall digital acumen, the overall digital quotient of our department rose as a result of the talent and of the work that we were doing and we continue to do, that we've been doing for the last 20 months, 18 to 20 months since we've launched and operated the Digital Accelerated. Another thing that was a very important priority for us was partnerships, because we know that we're not the only ones experimenting with artificial intelligence. We're not the only ones building data science solutions. There's plenty of experts out there. There's plenty of really good ideas for us to be inspired by, and also for us to contribute to the broader community and the broader ecosystem at large. So that's something we did very, very proactively with foresight, was to seek out targeted strategic partnerships with organizations such as Microsoft and Google, but at the same time with research institutes in Canada. For example, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, Vector Institute, the Quebec Institute for Learning Algorithms, or the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. We firmly believe that nobody knows everything and everybody knows something. So let's all come together and jointly push all of our goals further. And then the last thing was governance. I call this capability because certainly there is a sort of capability aspect to what it is that we can do in a focused way, but at scale. But everything we do has to be done within the rubric of governance. So it's not that there's some kind of a remote lab where all these experts are huddling together and specialists and doing all of this AI and data science and then coming up with end products on the other side of it, but it's totally opaque. It's sort of, we talk about the explainability problem in black box algorithms or models. Well, we certainly didn't want that to happen with our launchpad from a socio-technical perspective. So ensuring that there's full line of sight from our departmental decision makers into the rationales, the way we make choices, the way we make decisions, how we evaluate projects, how we prioritize proposals, things like that. It has to be something that we can get buy-in from all of the leadership within our department. Next slide, please. So in the last 20 months, we've had a number of successes. We've also had some opportunities to learn. So to motivate my comments for the panel discussion to follow, I'm going to talk about 5 lessons we have learned in running this digital accelerator. And I'd love to hear from my colleagues on the panel and Siobhan yourself. The first one was, I mentioned this, importance of strong partnerships. I mean, if you look at the technical domain of artificial intelligence, it is exploding. There's like every day, there's like a Cambrian explosion. There's some new breakthrough in machine vision or reinforcement learning or natural language processing or something like that, recommendation engine. So we wanted to make sure that while we're doing a lot of interesting stuff, that we have a broader network of experts and specialists that we can plug into to be able to transfer, learn, and to be able to collaboratively bring in their knowledge to advance some of our thinking. Second was really like how Michael talked about this idea already, but co-creation is the name of the game, because in my team, I have data scientists, I have AI experts, but at the end of the day, our clients are policy leaders in the department. Our clients are scientists in the department. Now, they see the value in AI, and from our perspective, we are helping to build these solutions for our policy leaders and for our scientists, but it's not in the model of, give me your requirements, I'll go away, I'll come back 2 months later, and I'm going to give you this amazing high performance model. It's all about co-creation. Is you bring your expertise from the domain, you're a subject matter expert, we're going to bring our AI expertise and data science knowledge. Let's put this together, have some creative collisions of insights, and create something that's meaningful and something that's valuable for everybody. So really, co-creation is the name of the game. The other thing is to ensure that whatever we're doing is properly documented. And it's not just that it's documented, but we're having events for knowledge sharing. We're convening groups, small groups, larger groups within our department, outside our department, being a part of fora like this, where we can come and share some of our learnings and learn from others. Really, it's to create this environment and this mind frame where we are open to receiving knowledge, but we're also open to sharing our knowledge with colleagues who want to partner with us. Very, very important is you can't manage what you can't measure, right? And so we've heard this, it's a glib saying, but really in the case of AI, it's something that's very, very important for us. We're doing a lot of work on this, especially in partnership with researchers from the University of Toronto, where it's great. AI, a lot of the power comes from those early experiments. A lot of that power comes from exploring the space of possible solutions and seeing what works better than something else, and then thinking about how you can productionize that. But very often, it's easy to get caught up in the technological sophistication of AI and sort of lose that tethering to the mission and mandate of the department or the strategic priority or plan. So making sure that whatever we're investing in AI, whether it's talent, whether it's compute cycles, whether it's buying a data set, whether it's acquiring a data set, what have you, there's an opportunity cost to everything in life. So making sure that there is a way for us to systematically and in a structured way tie any and all kinds of investments into our AI and data science projects with the strategic priorities and plans of our department, because ultimately that's what Canadians are measuring us on. And then last but not the least is let people know what you're doing. And so this has to do with a lot of this external outreach we do, a lot of external engagement we do. We have a good curated set of partners already, but we're always looking for expressions of interest from partners in the broader community who want to join up forces with us and see how we can create something meaningful together. So this is going to be the backdrop against my comments in the panel discussion. I'm very much looking to engage with Michael, Nudun, and Taka, as well as yourself, Siobhan. So thank you. And next slide is just our contact information. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vic. I mean, there is so much in there, like you said, that we can pick up in the discussion afterwards, but I really like the way you phrase it at the beginning, is don't forget the so what. So why are you doing this and how does it meet your strategic objectives? I think there is a real sense that, you know, AI is shiny and it's new and everybody wants to be doing as much of it as possible. But if it doesn't help you meet your wider policy objectives, then you need to be asking sort of questions around that. And as somebody who's absolutely not technical and knows very little about AI, I like what you say around the need for co-creation, for working with policymakers, for making sure you are all working towards the same goals, and very much the importance of sharing knowledge and communication and outreach. I think that's really, really important going forward. Thank you so much, Vic, for giving us your views. And then we will head over to Naden, who I'm sure agrees with a lot of what he's heard already. Over to you, Naden.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you for inviting me to the forum, and looking forward to the panel discussion with my fellow colleagues. Having been a consultant for a long time, helping clients in public sector to adopt new techniques and methods, and AI being one of the latest waves of adoption, my real focus is, I mean, AI itself, as you already heard, and you probably hear more from my other colleagues, about AI being a very complex and a broad sort of a subject. It is not always very easy to digest and to consume. And like we started the conversation, there are both immense benefits of using AI and in order to improve the way we deliver public services. But if you ask a citizen, a normal citizen on the road, but at the moment you mention AI, like Siobhan mentioned at the beginning of this session, immediately people start to talk about risks and issues that are perceived and associated with AI. They are not without those, but there are some real perception patterns around AI and risks. So I thought to keep it really practical, to share some of my thoughts around in order to look at both the benefits and the risks. I think you need to really have a closer look at what AI really means. It's not one thing, and a lot of people, the moment you talk about AI, tends to talk about machine learning, and I'm sure most of the audience on this session will be thinking the same. But AI is a collection of different new and sophisticated set of applications or technologies that allows you to do things that perhaps we couldn't do 10 years ago. It's not due to some of the techniques not being there. It's enabled by the economic nature of the technologies that are available. You've got cloud computing, you've got more power that is affordable, you've got big data that you can deal a lot of information with. So these things are made AI feasible, and AI in itself has got different type of stuff. So what we've been using computers for over 50, 60 years now. So what is the difference? It's another layer on top of all of the computerized automated digital services that we use, right? But the thing with AI that is most useful for applying into improving public sector service delivery in particular is that it gives you the ability to improve services. For example, I think Michael and Michael especially mentioned a few examples as well. In public sector, it's, most of the services that most public sector organizations deliver are for the benefit of citizens. So if you look at it from there are services delivered into business organizations as well. But if you keep your focus on, on a citizen, a lot of public sector organizations forever been trying to improve the way you try and integrate and tailor the services you provide in the context of your life events and your eligibility to actually receive a service from a public sector organization. These things were really hard to implement in the past because you had to write hundreds, if not millions, of different business rules using all the IT technology to make those type of decisions on a machine. With AI, without having to write and to maintain millions of procedural rules, it now gives us the ability to do more complex but more tailored type of decision making in delivering public services by being able to train the AI module or the machine without having to write and maintain millions of explicit business rules. Now, the benefit is there where it's faster to implement this type of stuff, but also to, the enhancement to the service is significant as well. But obviously, the downside is without being explicit about the rules, you will have to keep training it in order to get a very accurate set of outcomes when the machine makes those decisions or help come up with decisions that the human make. So some of the parts of AI that we talk about tends to be, as I said, machine learning, but some of my colleagues talked about the use of natural language processing. So when we talk to a machine, how does that machine understand us, but also being able to talk back to us, but also, in public sector, the millions of different documents and papers that we use on a day-to-day basis for admin purposes. AI again gives us the ability to automate the processing a lot of that without having to write explicit code, explicit rules. Computer vision, again, how do you recognize objects, people? How do you differentiate one type of an object from another? These are improvements in the space of AI. But the latest, I think, is most relevant, especially after this post-pandemic type of era, I believe, is simulation. So, things change pretty quickly. And even with AI, the accuracy of the predictions we make tend to be more short-term rather than long-term predictions, given the dynamic nature of the environment we live within. So simulation has become a really important way of making business decisions for delivering public services. So hopefully that kind of gives us a sort of a framework as to how you look at AI rather than using it as a single bucket. I think that you need to look at it from a point of the type of AI or the type of application that you're implementing with AI. And when you do that, you can then make decisions. So whether it was, a lot of people talk about barriers to AI, ethics and data privacy, those type of things being at the top of everyone's mind. I think one of the key, I would say, problems that people perceive is by looking for a universal answer to all of these different type of issues. And when I advise my clients and when we apply AI into public services, my advice is always about taking it on a case-by-case basis. So the way you determine whether it's a privacy issue or an ethical issue or assessment of a risk has to be based on the actual process you're trying to enable or enhance, and the impact of that service on an individual. So my first sort of point would be, there's no panacea and a single solution for managing both the challenges and the risks of AI. You need to take it on a case-by-case basis. Even within the same domain, come up with a framework and a process that allows you to do it on a case-by-case basis. The second, again, some of my colleagues already touched upon, another major barrier to implementing AI and AI-related technologies and techniques is to do with people and skills. Not only in public sector, all throughout the world, across all sectors, there has been a huge shortage of people with both technological skills, digital skills, and especially AI type of skills, because in a lot of the countries across the world, we don't produce enough people with STEM and especially analytics and AI type of skill sets and mathematical type of skill sets. So there are lots of ways to look at solving this problem, but one of the most practical but an emerging sort of a pattern and a thought process that's coming out, especially in the public sector, is to develop co-op models or cooperative models. And this is not, again, the only solution, but public sector is unique in a way that organizations don't compete with one another, and there's a much greater chance of public sector organizations being able to come together, use the limited number of individuals and the resources you have with the AI skill sets, but pool your resource together to achieve stuff that everyone across the public sector can benefit. This is an idea that is gaining a lot of traction, and both myself and other people within the industry has been really putting a lot of effort to take the conversation forward. So something to think about in terms of tackling these barriers. Last but not least, another, we were talking about this before this session amongst the panelists, is about public trust. Again, the moment you mention AI, everyone thinks, oh, what about privacy and big brother government watching us? The only answer to doing this, to solve this issue, in my view, and a lot of people I speak to, is about absolutely being transparent. We are public sector organizations, and there's no real need to be not transparent about why we are applying AI, how we are applying AI, and what data sets we use to consume by AI applications, and then being able to explain how AI is actually improving some of the services you as a citizen are going to be receiving. So there's no other real sort of practical way, and you can't, as public sector organizations, operate without the consent and the trust of the public and the citizens. So therefore, I think everyone across the globe in public service delivery, I believe, has to take the approach of being completely transparent. More you explain how you're applying AI and why you're applying AI, and the data sets you use to do that to your citizens, the bigger the trust you're going to get from those individuals, and therefore being able to do more and more to improve the services. Right. So I'll stop there. Thanks, in my initial thoughts, and looking forward to answering more questions and discussing more topics.
Thanks, Nadan. So really helpful at the beginning, just to remind ourselves of why. So Vic was talking about the so what, you're talking about the kind of why as well, which is, if we get this right, there's real potential to improve services for the citizens, and in particular, to be able to bespoke and tailor services in a way that simply wasn't possible before. But then, as you rightly mentioned, some of those challenges that just keep coming up, some of those concerns that keep coming back, maybe there's not a single solution for those. Maybe things have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But also, again, as Vic stressed in his presentation as well, and you said there, the importance of transparency and communication, I think hugely important. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding, I think, around what AI is and what it can do at the moment. Before we come to Tucker for our final presentation, just want to say Michael still is with us. It's just he's having a few connection problems. So he's just turned his video off for a moment, but he's still with us. He can hear everything and he'll still be with us in the discussion and the questions afterwards. And thank you. We have some questions coming in already, so we'll be turning to those soon. Please keep those coming in. Last but not least, over to you, Tucker, for our final presentation.
Thank you so much, Sylvan, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with your audience this morning. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm sure the different time zone for others as well. It's such a pleasure to be talking about from a public sector, but specifically from an oversight entity perspective and how we're looking at artificial intelligence. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I didn't realize today's conversation we were going to end up talking about Tinder but what a great example where AI is not only transforming how dating is done, but also poses those sort of thorny ethical issue in terms of biases, in terms of user interface, in terms of privacy. Just the other day, I saw a coffee brewing machine that supposedly have AI built into it. And my first question was why? I think my $5 French press just does as good of a job. So, but that does bring a question, right? I mean, just because AI is possible, have organization really sort of take a step back to say, do we really need artificial intelligence in order to meet the mission objective? And I think that's something that Vic has talked about as well. From GAO perspective, we do a lot of, just very similar to what Michael does for Germany, we do a lot of foresight, strategic foresight in terms of understanding at a macro level, where are we on that journey for AI? And something that I'm borrowing from the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, the way that they articulate has resonated quite well with me. I think we're squarely in what they call as wave 2 of AI. Mostly machine learning models capable of scope limited prediction, whether it is your loan application, whether it's computer vision, whether it is some sort of adjudication decision. But by and large, we're not quite yet at what they call wave 3 and wave 4, which are AI solutions capable of domain abstraction, reasoning, and metacognition. And one way I usually sort of explain that is, whenever I go to Paris, I love the French culture, but I don't speak a lick of French. So Google Translator is my invaluable friend in terms of navigating, city and go to various museums. While Google Translate does a phenomenal job of translating language from English to French, but Google Translate itself has no idea what I'm saying in the context in which I'm saying those things. So that's an example of abstraction and metacognition where even a small child is able to accomplish those type of reasoning, but the current prompts of artificial intelligence are not able to do so. But we're certainly in sort of a renaissance of algorithmic world, right? Between proliferation of data, between the cheap computational capacity, and certainly advancing, the data science techniques have really made the capability of equation of the AI, sort of astoundingly rapid. That certainly have driven a lot of conversations around the societal impact, disparate impact, bias, et cetera. So from Government Accountability Office perspective, AI has been something that is on top of our mind. We are swimming in many congressional requests to assess artificial intelligence. So happy to talk some of those work that we have ongoing. Next slide, please. So we're fond of saying technology is advancing every day, and we believe oversight should too. Too often, oversight entities are almost playing catch up. There's plenty of examples out there where, we would sort of wait till certain maturity of those technology before we dive into the accountability implications. AI is one specific areas that we have as an agency decided that we need a prospective view around the challenges, both in terms of performance, but also the societal impacts. So from, we have done a tremendous level of technology assessment relative to how AI is being adopted in the healthcare industry, in drug discovery. We have work around forensic algorithm. We have done spotlights and deepfake and other sort of AI related topics. One interesting duality that GAO does live in addition to many of these accountability issues that we tackle, just like any other organization, we are looking to experiment on adoption of AI capability. I have the fortune of lead our innovation lab, which is exactly, to support that kind of experimentation inside GAO and support specific auditor needs relative to use of, for example, topic modeling, various machine learning algorithm. And we actually have a very fascinating work going on using graph database to really sort of think through how continuous auditing might work, and the kind of machine learning algorithm that we can apply when you start mapping out the relationship across transactions and whatnot. Just like Michael has done a lot of foresight in Germany, we're actually applying topic modeling at scale to all sorts of information for GAO to identify how we can better scale and productionalize the idea of foresight scanning and environmental scanning. Nadoon talked about simulation. We're actually in the process of developing a simulation model meant to identify how identity verification could play a key role in mitigating what we call improper payments, which includes fraud, waste, and abuse. So there's, GAO is, just like any other organization, are very much interested in exploring how AI is helping to drive our mission, which is a unique one. We don't focus on just one agency. We focus on the entirety of the federal government. So, we don't get to choose, say, we only going to focus on accounting data versus justice data versus homeland security data. We have to have the capacity and the capability to address any and all accountability challenges. But what we find is that GAO are also called to audit and assess implementation of other agencies' AI implementations. So we need to figure out, to what extent, how do we ask the questions around the governance? How do we collect the kind of technical artifacts? And once we collect them, how do we evaluate them? And so those are both methodological challenge that we're facing, but also, frankly speaking, it's a workforce issue that we're facing as well. Having all these AI capability without a data literate workforce doesn't actually promote that consumption from AI solutions. Similarly, we need data literate workforce to be able to scope the kind of specific AI oversight engagement that we're encountering on a day-to-day basis. So relating to not only exploring the capabilities, we also have been sort of launching a number of efforts around how do we strengthen data literacy specifically for the auditors. And auditors had definitely a very sort of unique perspective on that, which I'm happy to get into. But also we're tackling the issue of data governance, garbage in, garbage out. You can predict all you want if the data that you're predicting on is not well governed, doesn't have the sufficient reliability or quality check behind them. So, from our vantage point, there's certainly within the AI ecosystem, a lot of conversations around capabilities, around trusts. There's proliferating principles out there that for the most part stays at the level of thou shalt do no harm, which I think is great. I think it's one of the very first time where data scientists and program manager are placed sort of a almost ethical and accountability responsibility when they develop these solutions. But the problem is, how do you operationalize thou shalt do no harm? Especially if you're developing, let's say, a autonomous vehicle versus a computer vision algorithm versus some sort of mortgage, adjudication process. Those have very different consideration relative to, what Nadoon talked about in transparency, explainability, sort of an ethical, implication of those performance. So, we, from a GAO perspective, we are in the business of verification. We would love to trust, but as an oversight entity, we want to see the evidence in which we can actually trust those AI implementation. So, from that vantage point, we're actually, if we can go to the next slide, we're working on first of its kind sort of AI framework that is specifically tailored toward how do we verify the accountability from both the performance perspective, but also any sort of intended or unintended sort of societal impact of those solutions. And one of the very basic questions that we'll definitely ask is, what is AI accomplishing in terms of those mission objectives? And there's certainly compliance issue that we will get into. Does it violate certain statutory, policy guidance, laws, etc. And then we get into sort of different sort of components of AI development lifecycle relative to data, relative to the model and components of the model, but also the ecosystems of models. And then I think important part of this is how do we develop a continuous monitoring framework? So the audit's not just you do it once and you're done, you put it like a seal of approval on it. But we all know AI solution tends to drift in terms of its performance. Certain sort of AI solution may be developed in one region of the country and then gets applied to another region of the country, where the social demographic profile may look entirely different. So those are the questions that we're looking to address under this AI oversight framework. And it's been a work that's been ongoing for a year. We're looking forward to its publication in July 2021. And this is a culmination of many, many discussions involving not only the state and local partner, the federal agency for sure, our Inspector General Committee, but we have involved the industry players, academic institution, international partners, advocacy group, and also certainly professional services as well. I'll give a shout out to the government of Canada. They've been very, very supportive in terms of our conversation in these areas. And we very much look forward to continuing those conversations. This AI oversight framework is not meant as, once we publish it, we're done, we're the end-all be-all authority. We recognize this is just the first of many steps. It is meant as an initial blueprint for oversight agencies to sort of evaluate AI. It is meant as something that should co-evolve as we move along the wave 2 of AI, as we move along the wave 3 of AI. And very specifically, we're not addressing domain applications. So for example, we're not delineating the differences between autonomous driving vehicle versus a computer vision. We recognize that that's something that those oversight entity and those program entities will have to take it even one step further to apply in their own context. So, just in summary, GAO has done a lot of work around AI in terms of our assessment. But where we see a gap in the conversation is trust is great, but how do we actually verify those things? And how do we take those principles incrementally down to the operational level? I'll just give one last sort of a comment here. Throughout the conversation as we were developing this AI oversight framework, there were certain assumptions that biases do need to be addressed, right? That sort of ethical principle do needs to be incorporated. But as a matter of fact, when you start digging deeper, that is not actually a universally adopted perspective. There are certainly data scientists out there that views their responsibility is solely focusing on the performance metrics, accuracy, recall, precision, etc. They view biases as a reflection of the world that we live in and not as responsibility for them to transform the world into something that we aspire to. So that was actually an interesting perspective in terms of just us realizing all the talk around responsible AI sometimes can feel like it's an echo chamber, that we are all in our own bubble talking about the same thing. But it's important for us to realize that may not always necessarily be the viewpoint adopted universally. So we have more work around education. We have more work around just these type of operational specific consideration. And something that we want to sort of get away from is those kind of ethical principle comparison, right? My ethic is better than Vic's ethic, is better than Nadun's ethic, is better than Silvan's ethics. Those are not the kind of conversations that are winnable. but how do we align AI implementation to the value and the mission of specific entity? That is something that we can evaluate. And so that's the approach that we're taking with this particular oversight framework, and very much looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much. Like, I love the way you started with your analogy of a trip to Paris and speaking French or using Google Translate, where we are on the journey of AI. I think that's great, but really good to have your perspective on the, the issue of evaluating and auditing kind of AI, because I think a lot of the challenges that you raise, a lot of the issues you raise around kind of trust and transparency, and you mentioned some of the trickier things there around ethics and bias, all of those, if you're addressing those and you can give a heads up to policymakers about what they might expect when their projects are being evaluated, I think that goes some way as well to some of the questions that have been raised about how do you breach those issues with the public as well. So I think it's kind of all a circle. And again, I think all of you mentioned there the need for cooperation. It's good to hear that there's international cooperation going on in terms of sharing learning and good practice as this is emerging in different countries. So we have got lots of questions coming in. So I'm actually going to jump straight into some of the questions I think that have come in from our audience, and I will be bringing Michael in as well. So we'll see, we'll either keep Michael just on audit, or we will see if when I go to you, Michael, maybe you can flick your video on and we'll see if that works. But let's look at the questions in. We had a couple of early ones in, which I think do flow nicely from maybe some of the final presentations that we had then around the issue of regulating AI. And does the panel have any suggestions on how AI should be regulated? And there are two questions on this. So one has come in from Carlos Carpi, and another one from Christopher Russell about what are the panel's thoughts around regulating AI? Should this be something that organizations and industries can self-regulate, or should there be an industry regulation on how AI should be developed and deployed? Very quickly, before I come to the panel for their thoughts on regulation, just want to say to people that have asked, is this event being recorded? Yes, it will. We'll be sending a recording around so you can share it with colleagues as well. So on the issue of regulation, Michael, I'll come to you because I can see you've got a good video at the moment. So let's come to you. Regulation while we've got you on screen.
Thanks. Yeah, excellent questions, I think. I mean, we're eagerly awaiting the draft for AI regulation by the European Commission that's meant to be released on the 21st of April. So I think, I think since it's based on a white paper, we already see a certain outline there. And I think, how do I say? I think maybe taking a step back from the question, I'd like to point out AI doesn't exist separately from the rest of the world. So I would go so far as to say it is already regulated to a large extent. There's certainly areas that are new that perhaps have regulatory gaps. But I find the discussion on should AI be regulated a little bit difficult because take the area of product safety, for example. Any product with an embedded AI needs to be as safe as any other product. So it needs to fulfill the same criteria for market access to the European common market. You know, if that's a self-driving vehicle, it follows the same road code applies, traffic code applies than for any other one. So ultimately, you have a lot of regulations. Where I think we have a deficit, and I think Taka already alluded to that in very, very good points, is how do we actually enforce regulation? Do we actually have governance systems that are up to their task? Are questions around risk assessment really adapted to artificial intelligence? I think that's sort of more on the level of the execution of existing regulation, and that's extremely important. But I'm also certain that actually we already have a lot of things that are regulated. You're not meant to discriminate when you hire people. Well, that's already the law. We don't need an AI regulation for that. What we need is to be effective in making sure that the current law is applied when you use an AI-enabled recruitment system. So I think these are just some examples out of the top of my head. Other than that, I think in general you will see that there will have to be some form of risk classification. I think that needs an overarching logic. Sort of how do we actually classify risk for artificial intelligence? We're working with the OECD right now on an idea for that. That's very promising, I think, and I think this will also play a big role in the upcoming EU regulation. And then, of course, any kind of approach or regulatory intervention needs to be commensurate with the risk.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I agree with Michael as well. You know, from an oversight community perspective, we already have specific audit standards in place that government programs should be effective, efficiency, equitable, and economical. Though there's no specific carve out for AI, whether as a further regulatory requirements or any sort of exceptions around that. But where I think we should focus more on our standards. So within the United States, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is actually working on AI standards. So when we say non-bias or labeling of the data, et cetera, what different criteria the agency needs to meet, but not necessarily in the form of regulation that says, thou shalt not use random forest, but thou shalt use regression in this way. I think that may actually create unintended consequences. And so it is a tricky balance, at least for congressional stakeholders to really consider, where does the standard stop? Where does additional policy and regulation needs to augment without really stifling the ongoing innovation? But I will add, in the recent National Defense Authorization Act, there was more than 1,000 pages of different requirements around commissions, around different capability investments and whatnot. So this is certainly an evolving area for the United States to tackle.
I think
And then
also
Adam,
I'd just
I'm
like to add to that, Siobhan, as well,
Yeah.
which is that if we think about it, right, like any good suite of regulations really has carrots, sticks, and carrots you can use as sticks. But the idea here is, I think there's a nuance to this, as Michael mentioned, right, that already discrimination in HR is not legal, but there is a nuance to that, right? Because if you're using algorithms and you're using models to drive screening of candidates or ranking of candidates, then if you cannot actually use the technical tools to evaluate those models and to look inside those models and see how those decisions are being made, it'll be very hard for a regulator to say, well, did you actually have bias in your hiring or not? And so this is the point I want to make very quickly is, from a research perspective, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings or confusions out there is that, people always talk in terms of black boxes and white boxes, right? That either you have models which are fully transparent or you have these completely obscure, inscrutable types of models. And that's not the case, because in the research community, there has been just as much as there have been these advances in algorithms and models and different kinds of techniques to pipeline the data, there have been commensurate improvements also in explainability, in interpretability, in transparency, in privacy, in algorithmic fairness and debiasing. So I think for any good regulator, they need to have access to these kinds of tools to enforce sort of their legal and the societal expectations into these computational artifacts, which are being used increasingly to drive these kinds of strategic decision making.
Thanks, Vic. Nadan, do you have anything to add on this particular issue?
Yeah, I have a slightly different point of view, but not mutually exclusive from what some of my colleagues said. But I think if you really look at artificial intelligence, I know it's much more sophisticated, but it's still yet another piece of technology that we are now applying into our day-to-day lives. And there will be more new, other technologies that come in the future as well. So I think, I'm not saying you shouldn't regulate directly into how AI is used at an algorithmic level, but at my wider point of view, and from what I've heard from lots of other people, is it's not so much the algorithm, but the outcome of that application in the real world is probably what regulators and regulation should be focusing on, because it doesn't matter whether it's black box or open box or white box. What AI does is change the way we do things in real life. And the real problem that we are facing is, regulations that was designed and made 20 years ago haven't seen those new processes or new ways of working. And therefore, I think it's inevitable, with or without AI, when we change the way we do things, you need to update and to create new regulatory frameworks to, to manage them and to avoid harm or unethical behavior. So something to think about is, even if you forget about the actual technology of AI, what is the point at which AI is applied, and therefore what's the actual, whether it's a business or a service output or an outcome that happens as a result, and how do you measure, back to Taka's point, how do you measure and test those outcomes to make sure that it meets the standards that you want to meet. And I think there was another question, Siobhan, if I may, somebody asking about, is AI going to replace humans or what jobs? Again, a slight different tact on it. With the application of AI, I think there will need to be new jobs where more sophisticated or the appropriate type of testing needs to be applied. So again, I don't believe AI, is replacing humans. I think our belief is AI working together with humans to enhance the process. But I think there will be lots more new jobs and new skills people will need to develop in order to cope with the outcomes of AI.
Thanks. I mean, we really have got so many questions coming in. We actually had a question sent in advance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two questions together. I'm going to put them to each of you, and you can choose to answer one or both so that we don't run out of time. But the question that was sent in advance came from Kay Smith, who works in disability employment advice here in the UK. And she asked what consideration has been given to people who have issues with IT due to a disability or ongoing health conditions. And I assume she means both in the application of the technology, but also maybe in some of the outcomes when it's applied. So I think that might go back to some of the, is there a danger that we do harm with some of these building in biases? And I want to add in, there's a question which I like, having been a former civil servant as well, is how do you deal with the fear from senior civil servants who have lived through failures of large IT projects before that? I guess that goes back to, do we have the right skills and the capabilities in the civil services to deliver these kind of new technologies effectively as well? So I'm going to put both those questions to you. One is about disability and one is about civil servants and being worried that we can't do this very well. I'm going to change up the order a little bit. Vic, I'm going to come to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Siobhan. I can take both questions. So I think it's a great question about disability, and to the extent, this is a big topic. So I'm going to use a specific scope of reference to answer this question from my perspective. So, completely agree with the premise of the question that people that are differently abled engage with technology in a different way. And let's use email as an example. Now, when folks that are differently abled are engaging with their email system, they might need to have it rendered in a different way. They might need the navigation to be different. They might need the actions to be different. And in fact, there is a startup in Toronto that actually studies different groups of users with respect to their different abilities, and then uses machine learning algorithms to train the design of software that is ideally optimized to cater to their needs. So for instance, if somebody is visually impaired, then perhaps there needs to be, and they receive a long email, it's not just simply a matter of text to speech where you're reading line by line. Maybe there needs to be some kind of text summarization where before it goes from text to speech, it actually summarizes the key points of the email and it reads it out to them. But somebody who's not visually impaired can actually engage with the software directly. So AI as a tool to drive better software designs to cater to the differentiated needs of differently abled people, I think is certainly a step in the right direction and is one of the applications of AI for good. I would certainly say when it comes down to the, once bitten, twice shy sort of situation with large IT projects failing, completely agree with the premise that Michael started with, that at the end of the day, artificial intelligence is a socio-technical construct. Failures in AI projects are going to come more from the social aspects failing than the software technology failing. So here, I think it's very, very important, as I mentioned in my opening statement, to have that connection between the what and the so what. So making making sure that there is an explicit and direct mapping between the design characteristics of an AI solution, far beyond exactly as Taka said, that it's not just about optimizing for precision, recall, accuracy, F1 score, AUC, all of those other technical metrics, but in fact having a suite of non-technical metrics around stakeholder buy-in, around alignment with strategic priorities and plans, around alignment with the mission and mandate of the organization. I think that's the way that we can ensure that evaluations are tight, and we can ensure alignment to make sure that we learn lessons from failed projects, and in the new designs, we have configurations which are different, leading to more higher chance of successful outcomes.
Thanks, Vic. Michael, I could see you nodding there, so I'm going to come straight over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I really agree, Vic, with all of your points. I mean, first of all, I can only underline using especially machine learning applications to actually improve accessibility, I think holds great potential. Definitely agree on that. What is important for us as well is, I mean, we have to be accessible in everything we do. So that's a general rule for all services that we provide, and not all of them can be solved through technology. So what we do is also, and I think it's important to keep in mind, to maintain other channels. I think that's just as important. I think I just wanted to add that on the accessibility part. For the fear of civil servants, I would also say I think we've heard from all contributions that we all work with agile methods. And I think that is really a deviation from the past. And I think that maybe making projects smaller, more user-centric, and working rather in small iterations in co-creation with your users, I think is really a way that can take a lot of the fear out, because it exposes at an early stage if things can actually work or not. And I felt that was coming through all of the inputs, that actually we all seem to work like that. And I think that's, I would assume that that's already a response to that. If it's a solution, I don't know, to be determined, I would say.
Thanks, Michael. Taka, quickly over to you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Relative to the disparate impact, what I find sometimes these conversations are happening in vacuum. So we should certainly, if we're talking about disparate impact, we should invite people that are being disparately impacted to the conversation to evaluate the solution, and not just in abstract setting to how do we evaluate, biases in sort of a laboratory setting. On the second piece, I'll say this in full transparency, trying to innovate amongst auditors is no easy task, right? Gio is very fond of saying, change is absolutely awesome as long as you go first. So, in terms of when we talk about implementing AI capabilities, we don't necessarily focus on the technical minutia or even the models themselves. We focus on the levers in which our middle management cares the most: quality, budget, resourcing, timeliness. As long as we can solve those challenges for them better than the traditional way, we find them to be very open to those conversations. Now, it's incumbent upon the technical community to make sure that we deliver on those promises. But rather than, I think resistance sometimes is sort of disguised in the form of, I just don't understand the intricacy, so I don't know what impacts are to my, the timeline of my engagement, or are you going to siphon out another, couple hundred hours from my, engagement budget? So it's just easier for me to say no. Yeah. So we really try to meet those metrics in a way that are sort of priorities to those middle managers, and not coming from a purely technical perspective.
Thanks, Taka. Nadan, I know you're very interested in diversity perspectives in particular.
I think a lot of the key points around AI being able to make IT and other things more accessible is already mentioned. And I think everyone knows, both in medical science sector and healthcare and learning and development arena as well, and education, AI really being applied to make huge strides in enabling people to learn in a more personalized, accessible way. So I think for me, it's a force of good as opposed to a restriction. Coming back to project delivery, again, keeping it really to a practical level. If projects fail for many reasons, but if AI projects and big complex projects fail due to lack of due to technical issues or lack of experience, I would take you guys back to what I mentioned before. Don't reinvent the wheel. And again, especially in public sector, I work with colleagues in other organizations who've already done this type of stuff before. Now, if you're doing something for the very first time in public sector, bring other people who've done similar stuff in a different sector. Always learn rather than starting from scratch. I think there is a little bit of a tendency to say, okay, I'll read a book and do some Python coding to come up with an AI or a machine learning model. It's good for learning, but if you're trying to apply into an enterprise public sector organization, you do need to think about scale as well. So a lot of applications of AI or any other IT projects fail. It works, somebody doing it as a proof of concept and an experiment, but when you try to scale it up to delivering services to millions of citizens, doesn't work. So one of the key learnings is, I always tell my clients, always look at enterprise tooling for applying AI. The availability and the nature of the maturity of the enterprise tools to do scaled enterprise industrialized AI is now here. It wasn't here maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago. So use them. It's good for individuals to learn by doing experimentation, but it doesn't work when you're trying to apply it at scale. So that's the key learning in making projects feasible.
Thanks, Nadan. I'm really conscious that we are technically at the end of our time, but there are still lots of questions. So if I can be cheeky and just ask if I can do one more question to the panel members, I hope that's okay. And also just to say to the audience, you should have received in your emails, in your inboxes, a feedback survey. Please do take a few minutes to fill that in, because it helps us to make sure that we keep delivering webinars that you want to come and attend, and continuously improving what we are providing for you. So I'm just going to go to the questions, and again, I'm going to choose two, and with the time allowing, maybe just choose which one of these you want to answer. So I think there are a couple in here around public trust, and saying surely one of the biggest issues is trust and public trust, and how do we address that? Should there be some kind of framework for trust or communication with the public around this? There's also a really good question. Is there a G4 summit equivalent for the tech world? So is there somewhere where kind of tech leaders come together? That's one that maybe you could answer. And then finally, you can choose this one as well. What's your experience working with CIOs and procurement organizations? With commercial vendors. So what are your thoughts on that when it comes to AI, the procurement of AI services? So there are three questions there: public trust, procurement in AI, and the other one was, is there a kind of global summit where people can come together and share ideas? I'm going to change up the order again. Nadan, I'm going to start with you because we haven't started with you yet.
In no particular order, I think there's no one global. I haven't seen a summit that where everyone comes in a company or organization or a domain agnostic way to talk about AI. A lot of these things are led by organizations who are specializing in various aspects of AI. But I have seen, depending on the industry or certain specific domains, for example, the European Union having summits, and in a government and public sector organizations having forums to talk about the adoption and the effects of AI. OECD, World Bank. I've seen a few, and even Davos type of conferences have dedicated a lot of time to talk about the development of AI in those specific industries, but I haven't seen any one universal thing. The other one around, I'll just stick to two. On the transparency side, I think I made a lot of the points clear before. I don't think you can have one framework that covers everything. So my opinion is that it probably get developed through different industries or domain specific frameworks. There might be some universal truths that can be incorporated, but a lot of these things will be developed on a domain by domain basis, is my belief.
Thanks, and Tucker, we can come to you.
Yeah, I'll address the question of procurement. Procurement graveyard is littered with example of good intention on AI development. Ironically, right, at least from my perspective, there is no such thing as AI procurement. We buy things to develop AI, whether that's data science platform, cloud environment, et cetera. There's no one mythical thing that say here is the SKU number for an AI and off you go buy. But it does run into a challenge where our acquisition folks are not always understanding the specific requirements of AI, but also how does that play into the cybersecurity control that are ultra paramount to the deployment of AI in the public sector. I've seen many instances where data scientists are using like a root level access credential to enable those models to run around behind the scene to do what they need to do. Talk about vulnerability in sort of a new domain beyond just the infrastructure side, but how is your algorithm themselves protected? That often is also a procurement challenge in terms of if you're buying certain thing, do they conform to, let's say, the NIST standard? Do they conform to the FIP standard and various other standards that the government agency have to follow? So plan early, plan often, collaborate with your procurement and acquisition specialists, because these things usually can take in an order of 12 months to 18 months before anything shows up the doorstep.
Thanks, Tucker. Vic, I'm going to come over to you for any of those questions.
Yes, sure. I'll just very quickly comment on the CIO and the procurement together. So the way that we're set up, and it's a great question, Siobhan, thank you for that. So the way we're set up, the lab that I run, we do a lot of the pilots, the prototypes, the proof of concepts, but the ones that need to be scaled, they ultimately have to go to our CIO in the form of these so-called containers, which can be elastically scaled. So I have a great relationship with my CIO, and we have that understanding where we do the pilots, prototypes, proof of concepts, they do the scaling. Also really like what Taka said about the fact that, you don't just go buy software, you don't buy AI, you buy components to do AI. I completely agree, which is why in our partnership, for example, with Google and Microsoft, it wasn't about actually software for bits. It was more about how do we bring our scientists and you bring your scientists, we bring our data, you bring your data. And of course, there has to be a governance mechanism around IP and those types of privacy and those types of things. But really doing it more from a relational manner than from a transactional manner has served us really well in our partnership with even private sector organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vic. Michael, we started with you. Your video is still working. I'm going to finish with you.
Thank you. Lots been said. I agree really with all points so far. I think, Vic, you earlier mentioned the word ecosystem, and I think that relates to the procurement question. It's a bit difficult, though, because I think very often we have procurement regulations that are not always conducive to maintaining ongoing relationships that you actually need in an ecosystem. So already at the stage of prototyping, even at proof of concept stages, sometimes we run into issues there. So my experience, I would say, have been a little bit mixed. But I definitely agree with the idea that this is actually what we need, an ecosystem from which we can then get the components we need. Perhaps on transparency to finish off, I think participation is paramount. Work with the citizens to create the solutions you need. I think that's generally, true to work, but especially with learning or intelligent systems. This is, I think, true. So I think the more you can involve the future users in the design of solutions, I think the likelier you are to have acceptance of such solutions. And as I said, I think it's also important, even though it may not be at peak efficiency, I think it's very important to remain a certain redundancy and have other channels available as well. So to avoid dependency on technological solutions alone, especially at least when it comes to our types of services.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. It's such a shame we are out of time now. We've just run over slightly. There are still questions left. We could probably have done with a part 2, I think, on this, and maybe we'll have to do that to make sure we get all of those questions answered at some point. I would like to thank the audience for really being engaged, for sending in great questions, but a huge thanks, of course, to all of our panel members, to Vic, to Taka, to Michael, to Nadan. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic having such great expertise. Thank you for giving up so much of your time. I'd like to also thank Deloitte again for being our knowledge partner today. And just to say, I mean, there was so much in that webinar that we will be sending around a link to everybody who's registered today so that they can watch it back and share it with their colleagues. And there will also be a write-up done, which will be circulated in a week or so. So that will have the key issues that have come out today. But from me, wherever you are in the world, I wish you a very, very lovely rest of the day. And I hope to see you at another Global Government Forum webinar very soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day.
Be well.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.